10 years ago in April 2016, Arriva took over the operations of the Northern Rail franchise, England's largest franchise, operating to over 520 stations, managing 470 of those, and having a fleet of over 350 vehicles. Arriva promised vast upgrades for the people in the north of England, but things didn't go as planned.
On the 29th of January 2020, the Department for Transport confirmed that the government will be nationalising the Northern Rail franchise, with, on the 1st of March 2020, Arriva Rail North's operations being taken over by the state-owned operator of Last Resort Company, effectively nationalising the Northern Rail network due to continued poor performance by Arriva Rail North. This marked the first time since Connex Southeastern in 2003 that a franchise had been stripped from a private company purely for performance-related issues.
In this video, I'm here to answer one simple question. Has nationalisation of Northn helped to boost Northern services and make them better for the people of the North? To answer this, I'll be looking at why Arriva got their franchise stripped from them, whilst then looking at what Northn, operated by the Department for Transport, have done to improve services, and whether they have done so.
All that and more in Northern's nationalisation success.
To start with, we need to have a deep dive into why Arriva got nationalised, as well as a brief overview of the Northern Rail franchise.
In the UK, there were 16 private rail franchises up for grabs. These were a geographic area of rail network which private companies could bid on to run on behalf of the government for the cheapest price for the UK taxpayer overall. England's largest franchise, the Northern franchise, was founded in 2004, following a merger of other smaller franchises together by the Strategic Rail Authority, and covers basically most places in the north, from Blackpool to Barnsley, Wakefield to Whitby, and Chat Hill to Clitheroe. The first company on this Northern franchise was Serco Abellio Northern, who I plan to make a complete separate video soon. This company ran until 2016 and made several improvements to the Northern network, whilst punctuality hovered around the 90% mark, pretty respectable for a company which operated to over 500 stations. By the mid-2010s, the franchise renewal period was here, with Arriva, Abellio and Govia all being shortlisted for the next franchise, which Arriva won and began operations on the 1st of April 2016 on a 9-year contract until March 2025. Arriva would invest over £400 million in new trains, replacing the dreaded Pacer units, whilst committing to running an additional 2,000 services each week, including a 40% increase in capacity on core routes around Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool and Newcastle. The new franchise would invest over £1 billion during its 9-year deal and promised a new hope for services across the north.
However, things didn't go as planned for a number of reasons.
One of Arriva's main promises when taking on the franchise was to increase the number of services and overall capacity, especially in the northwest, with passengers on the Northern franchise having hit over 100 million per annum for the first time going into 2018. A host of upgrades was thus be provided by Network Rail throughout the northwest section of the franchise, with electrification of key routes around Liverpool, Manchester and most importantly the line to Blackpool in the Northwest Electrification Project, enabling newer electric trains to take over these key commuter services. A number of capacity upgrades would also coincide with these electrification works, such as the new Ordsall Chord opening between Manchester Oxford Road and Victoria, and ongoing plans for an overhaul of the line between Oxford Road and Piccadilly, one of the most congested rail routes in the UK, known as the Castlefield Corridor.
Now, May 2018 was the month penned in for the big timetable change for Northern, with a host of service frequency improvements. Many of these service enhancements relied on electrification work being finished on time here on the Blackpool North line.
Northern would receive Class 319s cascaded from Thameslink to provide for these new service improvements, and began training drivers on them.
However, disaster struck when just 4 months before the timetable change in May 2018 was due to come in. Network Rail announced that a series of issues meant that electrification on the Blackpool North line was going to be delayed until at least November of that year. Critically, this was of course after the May 2018 timetable change was due to be implemented, meaning that Northern now had just 4 months to completely redraw their timetable to make up for the lack of electrification on the line to Blackpool North.
Bear in mind that it can take several months and up to a year usually to draft a full timetable change like this one. The biggest issue came with rolling stock, with there now being a lack of diesel trains on the Northern network, with many drivers having to hastily be retrained on the old diesel trains to run services up to Blackpool, whilst Northern had to redo their whole rolling stock allocation programme. As well as this, the timetable recast would have major implications on the Castlefield corridor through Manchester, with trains powered with electric trains now having to be re-timetabled as slower, older diesel trains, potentially hindering other Northern services and other train operators which ran through the corridor.
An impending rail disaster was now looming, with what Northern promised to be an additional 1,300 extra weekly services, potentially culminating in now one of the worst timetable changes ever. Not that passengers were aware of this though. Northern though still seemed to be pressing ahead on the fact that this timetable would bring unprecedented change to the Northern timetable. And well, that's exactly what passengers got.
On the morning of the 20th of May, many passengers expected more services, more carriages and higher reliability rates on Northern, but instead they got the opposite. Northern services, especially in the west, went into meltdown. The following day, Meltdown Monday as it was coined, was the first proper test for the timetable in commuter conditions, and it went, as expected, very poorly. 1 in 7 Northern train services were cancelled and 1 in 6 were delayed. #NorthernFailed trended on Twitter, whilst Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham said that the Transport Secretary should look into intervention, aka nationalisation. Lisa Nandy also echoed similar concerns for her constituents in Wigan. Overall, the new timetable was a huge disaster, culminating in a huge amount of disruption. Northern did apologise, but warned services could get worse. It took until early June for a new temporary timetable to be introduced, which culled around 6% of Northern services, including many in the northwest. Over 2,200 services have been cancelled or removed from the timetable within the immediate 2 weeks of the timetable launch, with Northern promising service improvements by the end of July. Northern's on-time punctuality score dropped from around 62% within 1 minute to 50% by mid-June, falling even further to 39% by November. Cancellation rates peaked at 6.9% immediately after the timetable change, but slowly fell to around 3% by September. So what was the main factor in this timetable chaos? Of course, we spoke earlier about the electrification issues, but there were other factors too. Firstly, there was no event steering group for Northern. Unlike other operators such as Thameslink, there was no coordinating body to manage the timetable transition. There was also a lack of communication between different parties within the industry, and there was a lack of technology within the process of making the timetable, with 10% of industry train planners' time being spent entering manual data, which could have been easily avoided, according to the main Office of Rail and Road report into the timetable disaster. Northern were also blamed for a lack of adequate staffing, a lack of communication with passengers, and a lack of information given to staff, meaning sometimes passengers knew of issues and cancellations long before staff did. A lack of accountability nationally within the rail industry also didn't help things. Northern blamed Network Rail and the unions, with Northern suggesting that unions were telling their staff not to come to work due to plans to remove guards on the upcoming new Civity trains, due to enter service in 2019. ASLEF and the RMT unions denied these claims, with the RMT stating all strike action, such as not working rest days, was completely legal, with both unions blaming Northern for the crisis on the lack of trained staff on the new routes. Network Rail stated they had no choice but to delay the electrification due to a number of issues, such as working over old mines and working with ageing Victorian infrastructure, but the North West electrification programme was probably the main reason for the 2018 timetable mess.
The Office of Rail and Road report stated that there should have been less risks involved in the May 2018 timetable, such as the whole timetable basically relying on the North West electrification project being delivered on time. Regardless, it was Northern's and Network Rail's joint fault. But Arriva was still expected to cling on to the franchise, despite a 2.4% drop in overall passenger figures, and an overall steep drop in passenger confidence in the rail network.
Strikes, though, did continue to threaten Arriva's survival, with 3 months of Saturday strike action by the RMT due to the aforementioned potential issue with the new Civity trains. Northern promised guards would remain on services but would not operate the doors, whilst the RMT weren't convinced. The union also stated that guards operating the doors was safer for passengers overall. A resolution was finally found in late 2018, which was the all guards remain on the new Civity Class 195 and Class 331 trains. Speaking of those trains,
they entered service on the 1st of July 2019, providing a much greater passenger experience than the horrible pacers which they replaced.
The trains featured aircon, 100-mile-an-hour operations, power sockets, open gangways, dedicated wheelchair sections, Wi-Fi, and modern passenger information systems. The trains featured large door vestibule spaces, so they could sweep passengers off the platform. The units also featured some of the fastest acceleration on any train, with the electric 331s accelerating at around 1.3 meters per second, accelerating to 80 miles an hour in just 50 seconds. The older Class 321-2s they replaced took around 2 minutes to obtain the same speed. The full introduction of these units finally allowed the May 2018 timetable to be implemented, how it should have been, just a year later, with the units operating along the Castlefield corridor to the newly electrified Blackpool North, as well as other electrified routes such as Leeds, Doncaster and Bradford. The diesel Class 195s replaced Pacers and displaced Class 156s to strengthen other routes along long electrified lines, with the units also running on the Windermere Shuttle and up to Barrow. Alongside this, Northern had begun to refurbish its whole fleet, including the Class 158s, with the first refurbished 158 diesel train rolling out in early 2019, featuring a completely new and updated interior. Minor refurbishments and refreshes were continued throughout Arriva Rail North's time as an operator, but this didn't mean that service performance would be any better. ASLEF failed to agree Sunday workings for drivers, leading to major Sunday service cuts for Northern, with Burnham calling for Arriva to be stripped again of their franchise, for failing to keep their promises of maintaining minimum service levels at all times. Also, Northern were perceived as having poor customer service and poor politeness, coming in bottom 3 for every customer service question asked in a Which 2018 poll. Even in 2019, The Times reported that the Department for Transport recognised the Northern franchise was unsustainable, with tight taxpayer subsidies making the franchise very difficult to record profits, with profits peaking in the first year of operations in 2016 at around £21 million, with a subsidy of £275 million from the government, expecting to drop to just £39 million by 2025.
Services in early 2020 were still extremely overcrowded and punctuality was still pretty poor. As well as this, the Civity trains had a pretty slow introduction, meaning the Pacer trains weren't going to be withdrawn before the end of 2019, like Arriva had promised, meaning the 35-year-old Pacers were still going to be in passenger service by the end of 2020.
Cancellations were still an issue in 2019, with 1 in 14 services cancelled in the last 4 weeks of the year, accounting to 7.3% of all services. Northern blamed the disruption since 2018 on industrial action by unions and delayed or cancelled infrastructure projects promised by the government, such as improvements to the Castlefield corridor. Arriva also opposed the government on a stabilisation strategy, which would have seen the franchise supervised by the government, with Arriva left running the day-to-day services, which is pretty similar to the remaining private franchises that we have running today, such as Cross Country or Chiltern Railways. Arriva suggested this voided their franchise, blaming the Department for Transport and Network Rail for unworkable timetabling and failed infrastructure problems, which there was some truth to. But this seemed to be Arriva's last hurrah, as they knew their time was coming to a close as an operator.
The immense levels of overcrowding, the poor punctuality to services, and the fact that Arriva hadn't responded to these issues very well, and that Arriva had rejected the Department for Transport restructuring programme, meant that it was no surprise when the Department for Transport announced that they would be taking over operations of Arriva by March 2020.
There had been some confusion, as, on the 2nd of January, Transport Secretary Grant Shapps had suggested that Arriva Rail North would lose their franchise, before backtracking soon after on live TV.
However, it was finally confirmed on the 19th of January that Arriva had indeed lost their franchise.
After several years of poor performance, poor customer service and poor timetabling, Arriva's time in the spotlight was over.
Even so, the newly nationalised Northn wasn't going to instantly fix all of Arriva's problems. After all, not every issue was Arriva's fault. A lot of it was down to infrastructure and old trains, but Arriva didn't make things any better. But
the fact that they responded to these issues poorly is what Arriva did wrong. They didn't communicate properly to passengers, whilst also trying to overachieve, working staff until burnout, and relying heavily on rest days, leaving them vulnerable to strike action.
The new Northern trains' main aims were to try and reduce the amount of subsidy, meaning less cost to the taxpayer, whilst also stabilising services. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps promised a number of improvements, including the withdrawal of Pacers and the lengthening of platforms at over 30 stations to try and boost capacity, whilst the new Civity trains would be continued to roll out. So the new Northern trains had a pretty difficult task in front of them. Would they be able to improve over Arriva? That was the big question.
Well, there have been overall significant improvements, but not everything has been perfect. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 significantly hindered the entire rail industry, with Northern services cut to just 45% of normal day-to-day services, although this was later uplifted to 63% by May 2020. The new Northern trains inherited a fleet of Class 142 and 144 Pacer trains, Class 150s, Class 153s, 155s, 156s and 158 Sprinters, and a range of electric multiple units, such as 319s, 321s, 322s and 333s. The new Civity 195 and 331s were also being rolled out, whilst new Class 769 hybrid flex trains would also be introduced to overall help replace the Pacers, Class 153s, 319s, 321s and 322s. The Pacers would, however, be retained in the short term, with 33 kept by Northern until the end of 2020, due to delays in training staff on the new, I say new because they're not new at all, Class 769 flex hybrid units, which themselves were needed to cover for delayed electrification works around Wigan. Northern, though, did quietly continue with bringing out the Northern branding across the network. Northern kept the same branding as the previous Arriva firm, other than some small font changes, with trains continuing to be refurbished and receive the new Northern livery, whilst the Civity trains continued their introduction into service. So much so that by the end of 2020, November to be precise, and the 27th to be even more precise, the last Pacers were withdrawn after 35 years of service in the north.
COVID, though, continued to make the headlines in terms of Northern's performance, with short notice cancellations being common between 2020 and 2022. But of course this is something that isn't really Northern's fault, because it was, well, COVID's fault, so I think we can cut them some slack for that. There was, though, some concern that services were being cut in more deprived parts of the north. For example, services around Wakefield and surrounding towns had their services pretty drastically cut compared to lines such as the one I'm on now, the Harrogate line, or lines such as the Skipton and Ilkley lines, which kept having a pretty good service. Northern, of course, denied this claim, but in early 2022, West Yorkshire Mayor Tracy Brabin described the cuts as unfathomable.
Service cuts following COVID were probably the biggest issue for Northern. For example, passengers in Glossop, who had services cut from 3 to 2 trains an hour, complained of horrendous overcrowding issues, with one passenger fainting 3 times on a service to Glossop in the rush hour. Performance was a continuing issue even after the main effects of COVID had concluded, with cancellations peaking at 5.3% in the 2023-2024 year, and a time to 3-minute punctuality rate of 79.1%, which wasn't that bad to be fair, and it was only 0.3 percentage points away from Northern's target.
Northern suggested that cancellation rates remained high due to staff sickness, and promised that digital innovations would be on the horizon to help manage capacity better.
Nonetheless, raw on-time scores for Northern were down from 2022 in both consecutive following years, whilst cancellations had risen for a third successive year.
Northern were at fault for 738,000 delayed minutes, up from 690,000 the previous year, but the majority of cancellations and delays were still down to Network Rail, aka infrastructure issues.
2024 wasn't much better, with their raw on-time percentage decreasing again to 58.2%, whilst cancellations increased again to 5.8%. Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham once again came to the rescue, stating that the service was embarrassing, following news that 155 Northern trains were cancelled on one particular Wednesday, with the rail committee meeting key directors over the poor service. It was revealed in this meeting that Northern was still using fax machines to communicate cancellations to staff and train crews, whilst they also came under fire for not renewing rest day working agreements, leading to further cancellations, especially on Sundays, an issue which still plagues Northern to this day, although this is also partly the Department for Transport's fault. However, Northern is also managed by the Department for Transport, so I don't know.
The worst line for reliability during this period was the Southport line, which averaged a whopping 20 cancellations per day, with then Chief Operating Officer Matt Rice agreeing that the service was unacceptable.
Matt correctly pointed out that the Class 769s were the problem and their woeful reliability, although this is not Northern's fault and is actually Porterbrook's fault, the train manufacturer, as I looked at in its own separate video on my channel. It does seem as though reliability is improving, thanks to the electrification being extended up to Wigan North Western, but there are still around 2 or 3 cancellations per day, whilst punctuality is still pretty poor.
The line is due to be taken over by the B Network, Transport for Greater Manchester's new sort of nationalised rail initiative, but how that works is a bit unknown at the moment, and services will still be primarily operated by Northern or whatever GBR replacement.
Northern were quizzed over their poor performance back in September 2024, at a time where around 20 to 35% of services were cancelled on some days around Manchester, with this rate being worse in Cumbria and Lancashire. It was also around this time that Northern received some structural changes, with the Department for Transport Office of Last Resort Company being renamed to the Department for Transport Operator Limited in preparation for integration into the new nationalised Great British Railways, whilst, in May, Tricia Williams became the new Managing Director, being promoted from the Chief Operating Officer role. She correctly acknowledged that Northn had challenges to face, but promised to face these challenges head-on by promising an improvement in performance, customer experience and inclusive work culture, something I think Northn have succeeded at, all three, since her time as managing director. At a similar time, the new Labour government finally stepped in to stop the rail strikes, which had been plaguing the industry for at least 2 years, which had also had an impact on Northn and other operators. But that wouldn't solve Northern's poor overall performance, which nationalisation was supposed to resolve in the first place.
But back to the main point at hand, with Northern services being, well, not the best. Northn promised a host of improvements to performance, including the hiring of a number of new staff members to try and reduce the rate of staff cancellations. As well as this, Alex Hornby was hired as the new commercial director for Northn, somebody who I think has played a big role in turning Northern's commercial fortunes around. Alex helped to promote the Little Switzerland rail plan around the Hope Valley line where I am now. £6 million has been invested by the government to introduce a new clock-face timetable on the Hope Valley line, as well as more intermodal ticket types, aka tickets which allow transport on trains and buses and other modes of public transport to help people get out and see what the Hope Valley line and the area surrounding it has to offer.
And whilst I was making this video, Alex announced more information on this new scheme, with a new ticket being introduced in Cumbria, valid on Northern, Transparent Express and local bus services to provide interconnected travel in the form of a new Ranger ticket. Hornby also introduced the 30x30 plan in early 2026, with 30 million more passenger journeys planned by 2030, including a new ticketing system and new trains. Hornby and Northn would introduce a new 90 and 2 promise by 2030, where, by this time, 90% of services would arrive within 3 minutes of their schedule, and a maximum of 2 services cancelled, or below. The promised improvement in performance, as well as new ticketing innovations and better customer information, would help to increase the number of passengers by 30 million by 2030, according to Northn.
Hornby and Northn seem to be grabbing issues by the reins and trying to find innovative solutions to them.
Northn have also been recently putting new stickers inside trains, giving key information about travelling by train, although maybe these would be better suited at stations too, given they talk a lot about buying your ticket, and why would you be on a train if you haven't already bought your ticket? Anyway, not the main point. Hornby also stated that moving trains from quieter to more busier routes was key to improving capacity overall, whilst Northn have recently announced the Class 150-2s would be moving from east to west, replacing the 150-1s, to help bolster capacity, whilst Hornby suggested that selling more advanced singles or on-offer tickets could provide a boost in passenger numbers. New services have also been introduced around Sheffield and Leeds, including a fast express Leeds, Wakefield and Sheffield service operating once an hour commencing in February of 2026, nicknamed the Yorkshire Flyer. As well as this, the success of the reopened Northumberland line, which I've so far failed to mention somehow, will also be key in achieving Northern's goals. The line, which reopened in 2024 and fully reopened in 2026, has blown past all passenger expectations and is now possibly going to be extended even further. New trains have also been promised, with up to 450 new trains being put into service by the start of the next decade, with these trains being bi-mode or fully electric, and will replace a large majority of older trains, such as the Class 150s and 333s.
Details on the new fleet are currently scarce, but we do know that their numbers are going to be the Class 382, Class 780 and Class 781.
The Class 382s will be new trains for the new Transpennine route upgrade services, whilst the Class 780s will replace the old 150s, 155s and 156s, with these expected to be some sort of multi-mode multiple unit. The 781s will be bi-mode electric multiple units, replacing the 769s, whilst later train orders are expected to replace the 323s, 333s, 158s and 170s by the end of the next decade. However, as aforementioned, details on these are scarce, with James Harper being appointed to deliver the 450 new trains, including an initial order of 130 trains, ordered by 2027. These new trains will be key in Northern 30x30 vision. Included in this vision is simplified ticketing systems, similar to the East Midlands Railway GPS phone-only ticketing trial, which Northern have now trialled themselves around Harrogate and Leeds, with another trial being undertaken around Sheffield. New marketing has also been rolled out, including individual line posters explaining specific reliability rates, and new adverts such as the "We're Northern, just like you" and the "We're not Northern without her." This communication has helped to bring the passengers back to the forefront of rail and Northern, and has been well received. Northern has been pretty constant in their ticket promotions, such as their £1.50 settled to Carlisle promotion and their £12 newspaper day ticket promotions.
And very recently, in June of 2026, Alex Hornby and his team have introduced a new Northern Explorer ticket, which for £35 gives you unlimited access on the Northern network for one day, with it getting cheaper the more people you add, or the longer you have the tickets. You can do it in like 6 consecutive days, and it works out at like £27 a day or something like that, which is a really good initiative and one that I will definitely be using. More importantly though, performance is also steadily, slowly improving.
Northern's target for 2025-2026 was for 80.3% of trains to arrive within 3 minutes. They missed this just, scoring 78.6%, but did improve on last year. 97.8% of services arrived within 15 minutes of scheduled arrival, and cancellations were down 2.3% to a much more respectable score of 3.5%.
This was the first year in a decade, excluding May 2018 and the COVID pandemic, that Northern's punctuality improved year on year, whilst there are currently plans underway for a major North West, Manchester, Liverpool, Blackpool timetable recast in May 2027, nearly 10 years on from that disastrous May 2018 timetable change. Hopefully though, with different consequences.
Northern also improved in every aspect bar 3 in their customer service survey, including a 6% improvement on delay handling satisfaction and a 5% improvement on train punctuality, but a 17% reduction in cleanliness at stations. And in the latest Transport Focus survey from June 2026, Northern achieved very good scores, including 66% in the value for money category, which is 7 points above the national average, personal safety on board rising to 87%, and a customer information score of 89%. Transport Focus identified Northern as one of the most improved train companies in the country, with Alex Hornby stating that we're all delighted at Northern to have moved towards the top of the pack and firmly away from the bottom in this customer satisfaction table, stressing that Northern are indeed improving in all factors. Passenger confidence has also recovered following May 2018 and the COVID-19 pandemic. Northern recorded their busiest ever month between September and October 2025, with 8.1 million journeys made across this time period, the busiest 4-week period since February 2020, with Northern services recovering from COVID, with Northern now running over 2,600 services per day, whilst nationally, passenger figures are now above what they were in 2019, although this is partly thanks to the Elizabeth line. Of course, not everything is perfect, and never can be. Northern were forced to pay £500,000 in accessibility upgrades, following an Office of Rail and Road inquiry into how Northern dealt with accessibility passenger concerns. Sunday services, especially in the North West, are still pretty poor, with Northern still failing to resolve the rest day working timetables. Stations in large towns such as Congleton near Stoke-on-Trent still don't have a Sunday train service, and I for one avoid travelling by train on Sundays due to Northern's lack of service. Northern have continued to state that they are making progress with the unions, but until something actually changes, I won't personally believe them on this matter, although I do really hope, for my sake and other passengers' sake, that this can be resolved soon. They have now refurbished all of their fleet, bar some of the Class 323s, which were cascaded recently from West Midlands Railway in 2024 to bolster capacity and withdraw the 319s, but they have received USB plugs, and some have now received new Northern seat maquette. Older trains such as the 321s, 322s, aforementioned 319s, 153s and the dreaded Pacers have all been withdrawn and replaced by the newer, much better Civity trains, which are still not bad trains 7 years into their service. Northern have still managed to run a decently reliable service with some of the oldest trains in the country, such as the nearly 40-year-old Class 150s and the ageing Class 156s, on things that Northern control such as staff absence, train interiors and commercial innovation. They are all excelling and definitely improving in. And well, that brings us to the present day.
Northern isn't perfect. No train operating company is. But from the hand that they were dealt with in 2020 when they came in after being nationalised, I think they've done a pretty decent job from the looks of things. After all, they do have an extremely old fleet in terms of age of trains. They also have not the most funding for a train operator, and there have been key performance improvements overall. Cancellations are down. It's not perfect, it's not where Northern want to be, but at least they're improving upon Arriva. Now, since I've been in the North, I was sort of expecting the service from Northern to be pretty crap. And sure, on some days it can be. You can be left frustrated by the old cancellation here and there, but for the most part, I've actually been quite impressed with Northern. I think their fares are pretty reasonable. They have some new good ticket innovations, such as this new Northern Explorer ticket, and they seem to be pretty punctual, pretty on time, and overcrowding isn't too awful. Now, obviously, I'm not an expert. I'm quite young, so I don't actually remember Arriva Rail North. I'm not a commuter, so I haven't been commuting since like 2016 all the way through, so I don't know what it's like to travel day to day on the current Northern versus the Arriva Northern. If that's you though, please let me know in the comments, has it actually improved? I've spoken to quite a few people who have said, on the whole, yes it has. There's always been some poor service for Northern, but it has improved since being taken over from Arriva. And of course things may change again with Great British Railways being introduced. We don't actually fully know the structure of Northern. We don't know if there's going to be a whole Northern sort of sector for GBR, if it's going to be split up or if it's going to be kept similar to the way it is now. We don't know. We do know that Northern will be rebranded to GBR Northern. That is a given, I think. And I guess apart from that, we don't know. For me personally, I hope that Northern continues the way that they have been going. I hope that they don't shake up the management too much, and I hope that they allow Northern to sort of be a bit more independent and do their own thing, because I think that's where they strive on innovating with different ticket types and advertising campaigns and new commercial opportunities. And I think there's a new timetable coming into Manchester in 2027, I think, which should hopefully improve services in the northwest, and new trains are just around the corner within the next 5 to 10 years, which is also very exciting. I think things are looking good for Northern, and it is also exciting, the transparent route upgrade. There's been talks of, if Andy Burnham becomes Prime Minister, will he revive HS2? Maybe the North fortunes are looking up. Who knows? I guess I'll have to come back and make another one of these videos in 5 to 10 years to tell you. So my overall answer to the question of, has nationalisation been good for Northern trains? Yeah, probably. And to sum it up in the words to a Northern driver that I spoke to recently, yeah, sure. Thank you very much for watching today's video. As always, if you have enjoyed, please do like and subscribe. As always, these sort of videos are completely my own opinion. Overall, I actually think Northern have done a really good job since taking over from Arriva in 2020. Obviously, I wasn't, as I've said literally a few minutes ago, I don't necessarily remember Arriva, but from what I've researched and from the people I've spoken to, things have improved, and the service that I've been on so far in my time living in the north hasn't been too bad. I've been quite impressed with Northern, to be honest with you. Obviously, not everything's perfect, but it looks as though the future is bright and promising with new trains and all these new innovative policies and ideas which are coming to the table from staff such as Alex Hornby and other people around the Northern team. It is good, and I think other operators should follow in Northern's footsteps in that regard. I must though, before I forget, say thank you to my standard premium member, James H, for sorting out all the tickets for this video. As you've seen, I've sort of been literally here, there and everywhere across the Northern network. I've travelled from Blackpool North all the way over to places such as Hull, and it was thanks to James who sorted out the tickets for me there, so thank you very much. As always, thanks to all my YouTube and Patreon members, you make videos like this one possible. I hope you've learned something new, or you've got a different perspective on things. Perhaps I've changed your mind about Northern. Let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Northern overall. Once again, thank you very much for watching this video. These videos do take quite a lot of time for research and then filming, so I would really appreciate your support. Once again, thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, join my Discord server, follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky, although I don't post too much there. Follow me on Instagram, although I post even less frequently there. And yeah, that's about it. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.
And of course, a huge thank you to my YouTube and Patreon members, including first class members Aaron Barry, Crispin McKee, JBNEL, Phil Smith and Tom Kennedy. My business zone members Andrew Bowen, Anthony James Moore, ARK, BK Gary, Connor Gregg, Clive's Travelling Trains, Craig Mitchell 43, Daniel Burford, Dave CDF, Henry Joy, Jay Teco, Gally 11, Lewis C21, Martin Thomas, NJTE, Ollie D, OVTUG Alex, Pete Denton, Real, SZWL, Train Life GB, Tom Kennedy, Will Ho and Zach Renfrey, as well as my standard premium and standard class members. you can help support me from as little as 99 pence per month, or get your name on this list from as little as £2.99 a month. All your support means the absolute world to me and helps make videos like this one possible, so I all appreciate your support. Thank you. Once again, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed. Check out my Discord, Twitter, Blue Sky in the links in the description below, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.